On the morning of May 8, 1969, in an unremarkable terraced house on Park Avenue in Bristol, England, police discovered the body of a 93-year-old woman who had choked to death on a piece of chicken bone. The neighbors knew her only as Mrs. Dennistoun, a quiet, elderly lady with faded elegance who lived modestly with her housekeeper. What they didn't know was that this frail woman, found dead in such humble circumstances, was once one of the most powerful and scandalous figures in British high society. She was Almina Herbert, the 5th Countess of Carnarvon, the woman whose vast fortune funded the discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb and the real-life inspiration behind the Countess of Grantham in Downton Abbey. But behind the glittering facade of aristocratic respectability lay decades of shocking secrets, illegal activities and moral compromises that would have destroyed lesser mortals. From her controversial birth as an illegitimate child, through blackmail scandals, adultery trials, and whispered rumors of illegal abortions performed in her exclusive nursing homes, Almina's story reads like the darkest Victorian melodrama. The police report from that May morning noted that the modest house contained only a few remnants of former grandeur: a silver photograph frame containing the image of a magnificent castle, some faded letters tied with ribbon, and a jewelry box that held nothing but costume pieces. Yet this same woman had once owned priceless Rothschild treasures, commanded the loyalty of kings, and held the power to make or destroy reputations across London's most exclusive circles. Before we continue with the story of Lady Almina Carnarvon, hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments which state or city you're watching from. Because this tale of American-style ambition meets British aristocracy is going to shock you to the core. The woman who died alone in Bristol that spring day had once commanded the loyalty of wounded soldiers, the devotion of powerful men, and the fear of London's aristocratic elite. Her rise and fall represents one of the most extraordinary and disturbing sagas in the annals of the British aristocracy, a story that reveals how corruption and deception can flourish even in the most respectable surroundings, and how the pursuit of power and respectability can ultimately consume those who sacrifice their souls to achieve them. In the golden age of Victorian England, when the sun never set on the British Empire and aristocratic privilege seemed as eternal as the stones of Westminster Abbey, few institutions appeared more solid than the great country estates. Highclere Castle in Hampshire, with its towering Gothic Revival architecture and 5,000 pristine acres, embodied this seemingly unshakable world of hereditary power and endless wealth. The castle's honey-colored stone walls had witnessed generations of Herbert family history, from medieval knights to Georgian politicians, each generation adding their own layer to the estate's accumulated prestige and power. Yet beneath the polished veneer of drawing-room conversations and elaborate dinner parties, the reality was far more precarious. By the 1890s, many of Britain's greatest houses teetered on the brink of financial ruin, their noble owners trapped between the crushing costs of maintaining their ancestral seats and the rigid social expectations that forbade them from pursuing commerce or trade. The agricultural depression that had begun in the 1870s had devastated the rental income that formed the backbone of aristocratic wealth, while the rising costs of maintaining vast households, extensive grounds, and elaborate social calendars created an economic crisis that threatened the very survival of the hereditary system. Highclere Castle itself required a staff of more than 80 servants to function properly, from the butler who oversaw the complex hierarchy of the household to the under-gardeners who maintained the elaborate formal gardens that surrounded the estate. The annual coal bill alone consumed thousands of pounds, while the costs of entertaining, an essential requirement for maintaining social position, could bankrupt a family in a single season. The great library, with its leather-bound volumes and priceless manuscripts, required constant maintenance and climate control that cost more per year than most middle-class families earned in a decade. Into this world of magnificent desperation came a most unusual arrangement, one that would bind together 3 lives in a web of secrets, ambition, and ultimately, destruction. The central figure in this drama was not born to nobility, nor even to legitimacy. but her story would reshape the very foundations of one of England's most prestigious earldoms. The arrangement that emerged would challenge every assumption about blood, breeding, and the sources of true power in British society. London in the 1870s buzzed with the energy of empire and industry, a city where ancient traditions collided daily with the revolutionary forces of modern capitalism. The traditional aristocracy found themselves sharing social space with railway barons, mining magnates, and banking dynasties whose fortunes dwarfed those of earls and dukes whose families had ruled English counties for centuries. The city's elite society operated according to unforgiving rules that were simultaneously rigid and surprisingly flexible. Bloodline determined everything. Scandal meant social death, and women, no matter how intelligent or ambitious, existed primarily to serve the interests of the men who controlled their fates. Yet even within these constraints, some individuals found ways to accumulate tremendous power, though often at costs that only became clear decades later. The key was understanding that Victorian society, for all its moral pretensions, was fundamentally transactional. Reputation could be bought, social position could be negotiated, and even the most sacred institutions could be manipulated by those who understood the hidden mechanisms that actually governed the world of the elite. The banking houses of the City of London represented a new form of aristocracy, one built on financial acumen rather than ancient lineage. These institutions commanded resources that made traditional aristocratic wealth seem almost quaint, and their influence extended far beyond the commercial sphere into politics, social policy, and even matters of war and peace. Among these modern princes, none was more enigmatic or influential than Alfred de Rothschild, scion of the legendary banking dynasty that had reshaped European finance through a combination of unprecedented wealth and equally unprecedented discretion. Known for his lavish entertainments at his Mayfair mansion Seymour Place, Alfred moved effortlessly between the worlds of high finance and high society, hosting dinner parties where cabinet ministers discussed policy with foreign ambassadors while actresses and opera singers provided entertainment that pushed the boundaries of Victorian respectability. His annual income exceeded that of most German princes, and his art collection rivaled those of major European museums. Yet for all his wealth and connections, he remained an outsider to the hereditary nobility, a man who could buy almost anything except the one thing he most desired: unquestioned acceptance into the innermost circles of British aristocratic power. This exclusion was not merely social, but reflected deeper anxieties about the changing nature of British society itself. The old certainties of blood and breeding were giving way to the raw power of industrial and financial wealth, and nowhere was this transition more visible than in the marriage negotiations that governed aristocratic society. Ancient families found themselves forced to choose between financial survival and social purity, while nouveau riche dynasties like the Rothschilds sought to purchase through marriage the legitimacy that centuries of banking success could not provide. It was Alfred who would orchestrate the extraordinary arrangement that brought legitimacy to an illegitimate child, salvation to a bankrupt earl, and scandal to a generation of British society. The consequences of his machinations would echo through the corridors of Highclere Castle for nearly a century, leaving behind a trail of secrets that some would kill to protect and others would die to expose. What began as a simple transaction, money for status, would evolve into something far more complex and dangerous, a system of mutual dependence and shared corruption that would ultimately consume everyone involved. The circumstances of Almina, Victoria. Marie Alexandra Wombwell's birth on April 14, 1876, were shrouded in the kind of deliberate obscurity that Victorian society perfected when confronting uncomfortable truths. The official records, carefully preserved in the archives of St. George's Parish in Mayfair, list her parents as Captain Frederick Charles Wombwell, a businessman and retired British Army officer, and his French wife, Marie Boyer. But these documents, like so much else about Almina's life, represented a carefully constructed fiction designed to conceal a far more complicated and morally ambiguous reality. Marie Boyer. Wombwell was a woman of extraordinary beauty and equally extraordinary circumstances, a figure who embodied the complex social dynamics that would define her daughter's entire existence. Born to a respectable French banking family with connections throughout continental Europe, she possessed the kind of sophisticated elegance that was increasingly prized in London's cosmopolitan social circles. Her education had been impeccable. She spoke 4 languages fluently, played piano to concert standard, and moved through European high society with the confidence of someone born to privilege and power. Her marriage to Frederick Wombwell had initially appeared to be a conventional union between 2 families of similar social standing. Frederick himself came from an ancient Yorkshire family with connections to the racing world and the military establishment, and he possessed the kind of easy charm that made him popular in London's clubland. But appearances, as Almina's entire life would demonstrate, could be catastrophically deceiving. The Wombwell marriage was, by most accounts, a disaster from its earliest days, marked by financial irregularities, sexual incompatibility, and a fundamental mismatch of temperaments that made cohabitation increasingly impossible. Frederick proved to be what polite society termed unreliable, a euphemism that covered a multitude of sins ranging from chronic gambling to suspected embezzlement from his wife's family. Contemporary accounts suggest that he had contracted substantial debts through horse racing and card playing, and that he had attempted to resolve these obligations through increasingly desperate expedients that included forging his wife's signature on financial documents and stealing jewelry from her personal collection. The situation was complicated by his drinking, which had progressed from social excess to what would now be recognized as severe alcoholism. By the early 1870s, Marie had effectively separated from her husband, though divorce remained virtually impossible for a woman of her social position. The legal and social constraints that governed Victorian marriage meant that she remained technically bound to Frederick despite their complete estrangement, creating a situation that was both personally humiliating and practically dangerous. She was neither free to remarry nor fully independent, existing in a legal limbo that made her vulnerable to social gossip and financial manipulation. It was during this period of marital crisis that she became involved with Alfred de Rothschild, then establishing himself as one of London's most influential financial figures. What began as a social acquaintance, Marie moved in the sophisticated circles where banking wealth intersected with continental culture, evolved into something far more intimate and consequential than either party had initially anticipated. Alfred, a confirmed bachelor who had shown little interest in conventional matrimony, seemed captivated by Marie's combination of intelligence, sophistication, and European elegance. The relationship that developed between Alfred and Marie operated according to the complex social codes that governed extramarital relationships among the Victorian elite. Officially, they maintained the fiction that their connection was merely one of friendship and mutual intellectual interest. Alfred was introduced as Marie's financial advisor and later as her daughter's godfather, titles that provided social cover for a relationship that everyone understood, but no one could openly acknowledge. In reality, Alfred had become Marie's primary means of support, providing her with a house in Mayfair, a generous annual allowance, and access to social circles that would have been closed to her as a separated wife. More tellingly, he began to take an extraordinary interest in Marie's welfare that went far beyond what any mere acquaintance might expect. Contemporary bank records show regular substantial payments from Alfred's personal account to Marie's household expenses, covering everything from servants' wages to the costs of elaborate entertaining. He also provided her with jewelry, artwork, and other luxury items that established her as one of London's most fashionably dressed women, despite her technically precarious social position. When Marie announced her pregnancy in late 1875, the timing presented both a crisis and an opportunity that would define the rest of their lives. Frederick Wombwell was officially still her husband, providing legal cover for the child's legitimacy and protecting all parties from the social scandal that would have resulted from public acknowledgement of adultery. But those close to the situation understood that the girl born that April bore little resemblance to the man whose name she carried. Instead, Almina possessed the delicate features and quick intelligence that observers noted were remarkably similar to those of Alfred de Rothschild. The child's unusual name, a combination that seemed to reference both parents while acknowledging neither, provided another clue to those sophisticated enough to recognize the significance of such details. More telling still was Alfred's immediate and intense interest in the baby's welfare, an interest that went far beyond what any conventional godfather might be expected to show. The arrangement that emerged from this delicate situation would set the pattern for Almina's entire life. A carefully constructed facade of respectability, concealing a reality built on secrets, financial manipulation, and the ruthless pursuit of social advancement. Alfred became Almina's unofficial guardian and benefactor, showering her with gifts and attention while maintaining the fiction that he was merely fulfilling his duties as her godfather. Frederick Wombwell, presumably compensated for his discretion, played his role as the distant but acknowledged father, with the resignation of a man who had long since given up any pretense of controlling his own destiny. But even as a child, Almina seemed to understand that her position was precarious and that her survival depended on her ability to navigate the complex deceptions that surrounded her birth. Those who knew her in those early years described a girl of unusual precocity, possessing an almost frightening ability to read social situations and manipulate them to her advantage. She learned early that survival in her world depended not on truth or virtue, but on the skillful management of appearances and the careful cultivation of powerful allies. The most disturbing aspect of this arrangement was how completely it normalized deception as a way of life. Almina grew up understanding that her very existence was built on lies. Lies about her parentage, lies about her family's financial situation, and lies about the true nature of the relationships that governed her world. This early immersion in duplicity would prove to be both her greatest strength and her ultimate downfall, providing her with the skills necessary to achieve extraordinary social success, while simultaneously creating the psychological framework that would eventually lead to her destruction. As Almina approached her 17th birthday in 1893, the carefully constructed edifice of her early life began to reveal both its strengths and its fundamental instability. Under Alfred de Rothschild's lavish patronage, she had been transformed from an illegitimate child of questionable parentage into one of London's most sought-after débutantes. Her education had been impeccable, conducted by private tutors who had been carefully selected for their discretion as well as their qualifications. She spoke fluent French, German, and Italian, played piano to near professional standard, and possessed a sophisticated understanding of art, literature, and music that impressed even the most jaded observers. Her wardrobe, personally overseen by Alfred and executed by London's most exclusive dressmakers, was magnificent beyond anything that most legitimate daughters of the aristocracy could expect. The famous Worth gowns, the Cartier jewelry, and the elaborate accessories that marked her appearances at London's most prestigious social events represented an investment in her future that few fathers, legitimate or otherwise, would have been prepared to make. More importantly, her social connections had been carefully cultivated through Alfred's influence to open doors throughout the highest levels of British society. Yet beneath this glittering surface, darker currents were already beginning to flow with increasing intensity. Alfred's generosity toward Almina had not gone unnoticed by London society gossips, and uncomfortable questions were being asked about the true nature of their relationship. Some whispered that Alfred's interest in the girl was more than paternal, a suggestion that, while almost certainly false, highlighted the precarious nature of Almina's position and the constant threat of scandal that hung over her carefully constructed social identity. Other observers speculated more accurately about her true parentage, noting not only the striking physical resemblances between the banker and his supposed goddaughter, but also the unusual legal arrangements that governed her upbringing. Court records from the period show that Alfred had established a complex series of trusts and financial instruments designed to provide for Almina's future, arrangements that went far beyond what any conventional godfather might be expected to create. These rumors might have remained merely drawing-room tittle-tattle, but they intersected with larger anxieties about the changing nature of British society in the 1890s. The old certainties of blood and breeding were giving way to the raw power of industrial and financial wealth. And nowhere was this transition more visible than in the marriage market that governed aristocratic society. Young men of ancient lineage found themselves courting the daughters of railway barons and mining magnates, while impoverished earls and viscounts calculated the precise value of American heiresses and banking fortunes with the cold precision of commodity traders. The social season of 1893 was particularly notable for the number of financially motivated marriages that dominated the headlines, and for the increasingly open discussion of the economic calculations that governed aristocratic matchmaking. Families that had once been able to choose marriage partners based on considerations of lineage and social compatibility now found themselves forced to prioritize financial advantage above all other concerns, leading to unions that satisfied economic necessity while creating new forms of social tension and personal unhappiness. It was into this atmosphere of barely concealed desperation and social transformation that George Edward Stanhope Molyneux Herbert, the future 5th Earl of Carnarvon, made his entrance into Almina's story. Born in 1866 into one of England's most distinguished families, Herbert represented everything that the British aristocracy was supposed to embody. Ancient lineage traced back to the Norman conquest, inherited titles that commanded automatic respect, and vast estates that had been accumulated over centuries of careful stewardship and advantageous marriages. The Herbert family had served English kings for more than 8 centuries, providing statesmen, soldiers and diplomats who had helped shape the course of British history. The family seat at Highclere Castle was itself a monument to aristocratic continuity, its Gothic revival architecture incorporating elements that dated back to medieval times while showcasing the wealth and taste of successive generations. The castle's library contained one of the finest private collections of historical manuscripts in England, while its art galleries displayed treasures that rivaled those of major European museums. But like so many of his generation, Herbert also embodied the fundamental weakness that was eating away at the aristocratic system from within. His problems were, on the surface, depressingly typical of his class and generation. He had spent his youth in the approved aristocratic pursuits, gambling at the exclusive clubs of St. James's Street, horse racing at Ascot and Newmarket, and various forms of expensive entertainment that were considered essential for maintaining social position, without any corresponding attention to the management of his inheritance or the long-term financial health of his estates. The extent of Herbert's financial irresponsibility was staggering even by the standards of his spendthrift generation. Contemporary records suggest that by his mid-20s, he was facing debts that exceeded $200,000, an enormous sum equivalent to millions in today's currency. The running costs of Highclere Castle alone consumed more than his estates could generate, while his personal expenditures on gambling, racing, and various forms of entertainment had reached levels that threatened the very survival of his ancient earldom. More troubling than his mere financial irresponsibility were the rumors that circulated about Herbert's character and personal conduct. Those who knew him well described a man of weak moral fiber and disturbing appetites, someone whose outward charm concealed fundamental character defects that made him unfit for the responsibilities of his position. His travels to Egypt, which he would later claim were motivated by archaeological interest and concern for his health, were widely understood to be fueled by his attraction to Cairo's notorious brothel districts and opium dens. Society physicians discreetly treated Herbert for what they termed continental maladies, a euphemism for sexually transmitted diseases contracted during these Eastern adventures. The treatments were both expensive and ongoing, suggesting that Herbert's condition was serious and that his behavior patterns were deeply ingrained. More disturbing still were the implications of his condition for any future marriage. as the diseases he had contracted could be transmitted to a wife and potentially to any children born from such a union. Even more troubling were the rumors that circulated about Herbert's behavior toward women of his own social class. Several prominent families had quietly withdrawn their daughters from social events when Herbert was expected to attend, and at least one young woman had been hurriedly married off to a minor Scottish lord after an incident with Herbert that was never publicly explained, but left her family demanding immediate satisfaction and threatening social ostracism for anyone who continued to associate with him. It was against this background of mutual need and moral compromise that Alfred de Rothschild began to orchestrate what would prove to be one of the most successful and ultimately destructive arranged marriages in Victorian history. Herbert needed money desperately, not just to pay his existing debts but to maintain the lifestyle and social position that his title demanded. Almina needed the respectability that only an ancient title could provide, transforming her from a questionably legitimate girl into an unquestionably legitimate countess. Alfred, for his part, needed to secure his goddaughter's position while simultaneously advancing his own social ambitions through connection to one of England's most ancient earldoms. The negotiations that took place during the winter of 1893-94 were conducted with the cold-blooded precision of a corporate merger involving lawyers, bankers, and social intermediaries who understood that they were facilitating not a romantic union, but a complex financial transaction disguised as a marriage. The terms of the arrangement, when they were finally agreed upon, were staggering in their scope and implications. Alfred agreed to provide a dowry that would settle all of Herbert's existing debts and provide an annual income sufficient to maintain Highclere Castle and its associated estates in appropriate style. In exchange, Herbert would marry Almina and provide her with the social position that her irregular birth had denied her, treating her with the respect and consideration due to a legitimate countess and ensuring that any children born from their union would be raised as unquestioned members of the Herbert family. What no one anticipated, or perhaps what all three parties chose to ignore, was how completely this arrangement would corrupt all three participants, setting in motion a chain of events that would ultimately consume them all in a web of deception, exploitation, and mutual destruction that would span nearly 3/4 of a century. The marriage of Almina Wombwell to George Herbert, 5th Earl of Carnarvon, on June 26, 1895, was celebrated by London society as a triumph of romantic love over social convention. The newspapers dutifully reported on the bride's ethereal beauty, the groom's distinguished lineage, and the magnificence of the ceremony at St. Margaret's, Westminster, where the cream of British aristocracy gathered to witness what appeared to be a perfect union between ancient nobility and modern elegance. The wedding breakfast at Seymour Place was described in breathless detail, with special attention paid to the elaborate floral arrangements, the priceless Rothschild china, and the presence of royalty among the guests. What the newspapers didn't report, and what most of the guests either didn't know or chose to ignore, were the far more sinister negotiations that had made the marriage possible, or the deeply troubling patterns of behavior that were already emerging within the complex triangle of relationships that now governed life at Highclere Castle. The marriage certificate itself, while legally valid, represented perhaps the most expensive fraud in Victorian matrimonial history, a document that transformed financial dependence into apparent romantic fulfillment and social ambition into the appearance of mutual devotion. From the very beginning, the Carnarvon marriage was less a union of two people than a complex business arrangement involving three parties with fundamentally incompatible interests and increasingly desperate needs. Alfred continued to exercise enormous influence over the couple's finances, effectively making both Almina and Herbert dependent on his continued goodwill and approval. The legal documents that formalized this arrangement were masterpieces of Victorian financial engineering, creating a system of trusts, allowances, and conditional payments that ensured Alfred's control while maintaining the fiction of the Earl's independence. Herbert resented this dependence, even as he was powerless to escape it. His pride continually wounded by reminders of his financial subservience to a man he considered his social inferior. The psychological impact of this humiliation was profound, leading to increasingly erratic behavior that alternated between periods of sullen resentment and explosive anger, directed primarily at his wife, who served as a visible reminder of his degraded status. Meanwhile, Almina found herself caught between loyalty to her benefactor and the demands of her new role as a countess, a position that required her to maintain the fiction that her marriage was based on genuine affection, while simultaneously managing the complex web of financial and social obligations that actually governed her existence. The strain of maintaining these multiple deceptions began to show almost immediately, as observers noted her growing tendency toward controlling behavior and her obvious unhappiness despite her apparent social triumph. The psychological dynamics of this arrangement proved to be extraordinarily toxic for all three participants. Herbert's natural weakness and moral cowardice were exacerbated by his financial humiliation, leading him to seek compensation through increasingly reckless behavior that pushed the boundaries of acceptable aristocratic conduct. His trips to Egypt became longer and more frequent, and the stories that filtered back to England suggested activities that went far beyond archaeological research or health-seeking travel. Contemporary accounts from British expatriates in Cairo describe Herbert as a familiar figure in the city's most disreputable quarters, where European gentlemen could indulge in pleasures that would have been unthinkable in London society. The brothels, opium dens, and gambling houses that catered to wealthy visitors became Herbert's primary haunts, and his behavior in these establishments was reportedly so excessive that it shocked even the habitually jaded proprietors who served the international demimonde. More disturbing still were the reports that Herbert had begun to involve himself in activities that bordered on the criminal, including the illegal antiquities trade that flourished in Egypt during this period. Several contemporary sources suggest that Herbert's later legitimate archaeological activities served partly as cover for an ongoing involvement in the smuggling of ancient artifacts, a lucrative but dangerous business that brought him into contact with some of the most unsavory characters in the Eastern Mediterranean. Meanwhile, Almina discovered that her new position as a countess, while providing the social respectability she had craved, came with its own set of constraints and expectations that often conflicted with her natural intelligence and ambition. The role of a Victorian countess was largely ceremonial, involving an endless round of social obligations that required enormous expenditure, but provided little in the way of genuine power or influence. She was expected to entertain, to patronize appropriate charities, and to serve as an ornament to her husband's social position. But she was discouraged from expressing independent opinions or pursuing interests that might be considered unfeminine or inappropriate. The frustration of these constraints began to manifest itself in increasingly controlling behavior toward her household staff, her social circle, and eventually toward anyone who fell within her sphere of influence. Servants at Highclere began to report incidents of explosive anger over minor infractions, and several long-term employees left their positions, citing the Countess's impossible demands and unpredictable temperament. More disturbing still were the rumors that began to circulate about the couple's private life and the true nature of their relationship. Visitors to Highclere noted the visible tension between husband and wife, the careful way they avoided private conversation, and Almina's obvious unhappiness despite her outward success. The elaborate entertainments that the couple hosted were described as brilliantly orchestrated but somehow hollow, lacking the genuine warmth and spontaneity that characterized truly happy households. Most troubling of all were the questions that began to surround the parentage of the couple's children, particularly their son Henry, born on November 7, 1898. The birth of Henry Herbert should have been a moment of celebration for the Carnarvon family, securing the succession and providing an heir to carry on the ancient Herbert line. The elaborate christening ceremony, held in the private chapel at Highclere, was attended by representatives of the royal family and celebrated as a triumph of aristocratic continuity. Instead, the event became the source of new anxieties and whispered speculations that would haunt the family for generations to come. Those who saw the infant noted immediately that he bore little resemblance to either of his official parents, possessing instead the darker coloring and distinctive facial features that observers associated with the Earl's close friend, Prince Victor Duleep Singh, the son of the deposed Maharaja of Lahore. Prince Victor, a godson of Queen Victoria and a prominent figure in London society, had been Herbert's closest companion since their days together at Eton College. A man of extraordinary charm and sophistication, he possessed the kind of exotic appeal that made him popular in drawing rooms where conventional English gentlemen were considered boring. His frequent visits to Highclere had been noted by society gossips long before Henry's birth, particularly the way his presence seemed to transform Almina's demeanor from nervous anxiety to genuine happiness. The implications of these observations were staggering for all concerned. If Prince Victor was indeed Henry's father, it meant that the heir to the Carnarvon earldom was not actually a Herbert at all, but the illegitimate son of an Indian prince. Such a revelation would not only have destroyed the family's reputation, but could potentially have invalidated Henry's eventual inheritance, throwing the entire Herbert succession into legal chaos. More immediately threatening was the possibility that the Earl himself was aware of the situation and was using his knowledge as leverage in his increasingly complex relationships with both his wife and her benefactor. Contemporary evidence suggests that Herbert was indeed aware of his wife's infidelity and that he chose to ignore it for reasons that were as calculated as they were cowardly. The prince's wealth and social connections made him a valuable ally at a time when Herbert desperately needed both financial support and social protection. Prince Victor's annual income from his Indian estates, combined with the generous allowance provided by the British government, made him one of London's wealthiest bachelors. His friendship could provide Herbert with access to investment opportunities, social connections, and financial assistance that might help offset his continuing dependence on Alfred de Rothschild. By maintaining the fiction of Henry's legitimacy, Herbert preserved not only his own dignity, but also his access to Alfred's continued financial support, which would have been threatened by any public acknowledgement of his wife's adultery. The arrangement allowed all parties to maintain their social positions while pursuing their individual interests, but it also created a web of mutual blackmail and shared guilt that would ultimately prove impossible to sustain. For Almina, the situation presented a different kind of moral compromise that would shape the rest of her life. She had achieved everything she had been taught to want: title, wealth, social position, but only at the cost of living a lie that grew more complex and dangerous with each passing year. The child she loved was not her husband's son. Her marriage was a sham maintained only for financial convenience, and her entire social position rested on a foundation of secrets that could be exposed at any moment. These psychological pressures began to manifest themselves in increasingly erratic behavior that worried even her closest associates. Friends noted her growing obsession with control over her household, her finances, and the people around her. She developed what observers described as an almost pathological need to maintain detailed knowledge of other people's secrets, as if gathering such information might somehow protect her from exposure of her own vulnerabilities. More ominously, Almina began to display the manipulative skills that would later make her both feared and influential within London society. She learned to use her knowledge of other people's weaknesses as tools for advancing her own interests, whether through subtle blackmail, strategic social ostracism, or more direct forms of coercion. What had begun as defensive measures gradually evolved into a comprehensive system for exercising power over others, a system that would eventually extend far beyond the drawing rooms of Highclere Castle into the highest levels of British political and social life. The outbreak of World War I in August 1914 provided Almina with an unexpected opportunity to reinvent herself once again, this time as a patriotic benefactor devoted to the care of wounded soldiers. Her decision to convert Highclere Castle into a military hospital was initially praised by newspapers and society observers as an example of aristocratic duty and selfless service to the nation during its hour of greatest need. The transformation seemed to represent everything that was finest about the British aristocratic tradition: the willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for public service, the application of private wealth to national purposes, and the maintenance of British values even in the face of unprecedented global crisis. What the public didn't understand, however, was how completely this venture reflected the darker patterns that had already come to define Almina's character. The need for absolute control over everyone in her environment, the manipulation of noble causes for personal advantage, and the systematic exploitation of vulnerable individuals who found themselves dependent on her charity. The hospital project would ultimately reveal not Almina's capacity for genuine altruism, but her genius for disguising self-interest as public service and for extracting maximum personal benefit from apparently generous gestures. The transformation of Highclere into a military hospital was indeed remarkable in its scope and apparent generosity, representing an investment of both money and effort that few private individuals would have been willing or able to make. Almina spared no expense in creating what was arguably the most luxurious medical facility in Britain, complete with modern operating theatres equipped with the latest surgical instruments, individual rooms for each patient furnished with fine linens and comfortable furniture, and a level of comfort that far exceeded anything available in conventional military hospitals. The castle's great rooms were converted into wards that resembled luxury hotel suites more than medical facilities, with patients sleeping in beds that had previously accommodated royal visitors and dining on china that bore the Herbert family crest. Professional nurses were recruited from London's most prestigious hospitals, while a team of renowned surgeons provided medical care that would have been the envy of Harley Street private practice. The hospital's operating theatres were equipped with the most advanced medical technology available, including X-ray equipment and electric lighting that made round-the-clock surgery possible. Officers wounded in the trenches of France and Belgium found themselves recovering in surroundings of almost unimaginable elegance, attended by staff who addressed them by their military ranks and served meals that rivaled those of London's finest restaurants. The contrast with the brutal conditions they had left behind in the war zone was so stark that many patients initially believed they were hallucinating, unable to comprehend how they had been transported from the hell of the Western Front to what appeared to be a palace dedicated to their comfort and recovery. But beneath this veneer of aristocratic charity, more troubling dynamics were at work that revealed the true nature of Almina's motivations and methods. Her selection of patients was far from random or based purely on medical need. She carefully chose men whose backgrounds, military records, and family connections aligned with her own social and financial interests. Officers from prominent families, men with distinguished service records, and those with potential usefulness to her expanding network of influence found themselves welcomed to Highclere, while enlisted men of equally severe injuries were quietly directed to other, less luxurious facilities. The criteria for admission to Highclere Military Hospital had less to do with the severity of wounds or the urgency of medical need than with the potential value that each patient might provide to Almina's long-term social and financial plans. Young officers from aristocratic families were particularly sought after, as their gratitude could be converted into useful social connections for years to come. Men with backgrounds in banking, law, or government service were similarly prized, as their professional expertise might prove valuable in future business ventures. More significantly, Almina began to use her role as benefactress to cultivate a network of grateful dependents who could be called upon for various favors in the years to come. The psychological dynamics of the hospital were carefully calculated to create bonds of obligation that extended far beyond the period of medical treatment, transforming temporary patients into permanent debtors who understood that their social and professional futures might depend on their continued loyalty to their former benefactress. The psychological dynamics within the hospital were equally disturbing when examined closely. Almina's need for control manifested itself in an obsessive attention to every detail of her patients' lives, from their medical treatment to their personal correspondence and private conversations. She maintained detailed files on each patient that went far beyond medical records, including information about their family backgrounds, financial situations, personal relationships, and private confessions made during their most vulnerable moments. Under the guise of ensuring proper care, Almina instituted a system of surveillance that would have impressed the most paranoid Victorian patriarch. She read their letters both incoming and outgoing, monitored their visitors, and kept detailed records of their conversations with other patients, nurses, and visiting family members. What she presented as maternal concern for their well-being was, in reality, a systematic program of information gathering that would provide her with intimate knowledge of these men's lives, weaknesses, and secrets for years to come. The nurses and medical staff were instructed to report not only on their patient's physical condition, but also on their emotional state, their private fears and anxieties, and any personal information they revealed during treatment. This intelligence network extended beyond the medical staff to include servants, orderlies, and even other patients, creating an atmosphere of constant observation that some of the more perceptive officers found deeply unsettling. More troubling still were the rumors that began to circulate about Almina's personal relationships with certain patients, particularly young officers who came from prominent families or who possessed particular physical attractiveness. Several wounded officers spoke privately to friends and family members about the Countess's habit of visiting their rooms late at night, ostensibly to check on their comfort and progress, but often engaging in conversations that seemed designed to extract intimate confessions about their fears, their family situations, their romantic relationships, and their future plans. These nocturnal visits followed a pattern that became increasingly recognizable to those who experienced them. Almina would arrive in the patient's room dressed in elegant but somewhat revealing nightwear, carrying a tray with brandy or other medicinal spirits that she claimed would help with sleep and pain management. She would then settle into a chair beside the bed and engage the patient in what appeared to be casual conversation, but was actually a sophisticated interrogation designed to elicit personal information that might prove useful later. Some patients described feeling uncomfortable about these encounters, noting that Almina seemed to take an unusual interest in their most vulnerable moments and private thoughts. Others found themselves drawn into intimate conversations that they later regretted, revealing details about their families, their financial situations, or their personal relationships that they would never have shared under normal circumstances. A few reported that these conversations had taken on overtones that seemed inappropriately intimate, with the Countess making remarks or gestures that suggested interests that went beyond mere medical or maternal concern. The Earl's reaction to his wife's hospital activities revealed both his fundamental weakness and his growing awareness of the dangerous game she was playing with increasingly powerful and potentially dangerous individuals. Privately, he referred to Highclere as Carnarvon, amputate, a bitter joke that reflected not only his resentment at being displaced from his own home, but also his suspicion that Almina's motivations were far from purely charitable, and that her methods were creating risks that could ultimately destroy them all. Yet Herbert was powerless to intervene effectively, both because of his continued financial dependence on Alfred's support, and because Almina's public image as a devoted nurse and patriotic benefactress made any criticism of her activities socially impossible. Any attempt to challenge her hospital operations would have been seen as unpatriotic selfishness, while his own reputation for weakness and moral compromise meant that his objections would carry little weight with public opinion or government authorities. The situation became even more complex and potentially explosive when Almina decided to expand her operations to London, opening a second hospital at 48 Bryanston Square in one of Mayfair's most prestigious neighborhoods. This facility, while smaller than Highclere, operated under even less oversight, and became the site of activities that pushed the boundaries of both medical ethics and legal propriety in ways that would have shocked even the most worldly observers of London society. The London hospital attracted a different class of patients than Highclere, including foreign officers, government officials, and wealthy civilians who had been injured in air raids or other war-related incidents. The facility's location in the heart of London's diplomatic quarter made it a natural gathering place for international visitors, creating opportunities for intelligence gathering and influence peddling that Almina was quick to exploit. Patients at Bryanston Square reported medical procedures that seemed designed more to extract information than to promote healing, including the use of experimental drugs that induced states of relaxation and talkativeness that made patients unusually willing to share sensitive information about their governments, military operations, or personal circumstances. Some described feeling as though they had been drugged during their treatment, experiencing periods of confusion and memory loss that made it difficult to recall exactly what they had said or done during their stay. It was during this period that Almina began to develop the network of medical professionals who would later enable her most controversial and potentially criminal activities. Dr. Harold Hendy, who served as chief medical officer at both hospitals, was a man of questionable credentials whose previous practice had been marked by several suspicious incidents involving wealthy female patients who had required emergency treatment for undisclosed conditions. Under Dr. Hendy's guidance, both hospitals began to offer services that extended far beyond conventional military medicine, including procedures and treatments that were not generally available through normal medical channels. The nature of these services was kept strictly confidential, but contemporary records suggest that they included everything from cosmetic surgery to treat disfiguring war wounds to more controversial procedures that addressed delicate medical conditions affecting both male and female patients. The most disturbing aspect of Almina's wartime activities was the way they normalized the systematic exploitation of vulnerable individuals in the name of patriotic duty and charitable service. The wounded officers who benefited from her care were also, whether they realized it or not, being inducted into a system of obligation and dependence that would follow them for the rest of their lives, creating a network of influence that extended throughout the highest levels of British military, political, and social leadership. Those who proved useful to Almina's purposes found their careers mysteriously advanced, their social connections mysteriously expanded, and their access to opportunities mysteriously improved. Letters of recommendation appeared from unexpected sources, introductions were made to influential individuals, and financial opportunities presented themselves with convenient timing. The recipients of this assistance understood, without being explicitly told, that their good fortune came with certain expectations and obligations that would need to be honored in the future. Conversely, those who failed to show appropriate gratitude or who seemed reluctant to participate in Almina's expanding network of mutual obligation discovered that their reputations could be just as mysteriously damaged. Rumors circulated about their conduct during their hospital stay. Questions were raised about their fitness for promotion or important assignments, and social invitations mysteriously ceased to arrive. By the war's end in November 1918, Almina had successfully transformed herself from a marginally legitimate countess into one of London's most influential women, commanding a network of grateful dependents that included decorated war heroes, rising political figures, and successful businessmen who had all passed through her hospitals during their most vulnerable moments. But the method she had used to achieve this transformation had also created a web of secrets, obligations, and potential exposures that made her position more precarious than ever before. The stage was being set for the final, most destructive phase of her career. A phase that would ultimately consume not only Almina herself, but nearly everyone who had the misfortune to become entangled in her increasingly complex and dangerous web of manipulation and deceit. Just when we thought we'd seen the depths of Almina's manipulation during the war, her story takes an even darker turn in the post-war years. If this tale of aristocratic corruption is sending chills down your spine, share this video with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Because what happens next will show us just how far a desperate woman will go to protect her secrets and maintain her power. The death of Lord Carnarvon in Cairo on April 5, 1923, marked the beginning of the most scandalous and destructive period of Almina's life, a phase that would reveal the full extent of her capacity for deception, manipulation, and moral compromise. The official cause of death, blood poisoning following an infected mosquito bite received while visiting Tutankhamun's newly discovered tomb, provided convenient cover for what many contemporary observers suspected was a far more complex and sinister situation involving the Earl's deteriorating health, his increasingly erratic behavior, and the dangerous games of power and influence that had to define his marriage. Contemporary medical records, preserved in the archives of the British consulate in Cairo, suggest that Carnarvon had been seriously ill for weeks before his death, suffering from symptoms that the attending physicians struggled to explain, but that modern medical analysis indicates may have been related to advanced syphilis contracted during his frequent visits to Cairo's notorious entertainment districts. The progression of his illness, marked by periods of delirium, violent mood swings, and physical deterioration, was consistent with the final stages of untreated venereal disease, a condition that would have been impossible to acknowledge publicly without destroying the family's reputation. More immediately significant than the actual cause of Carnarvon's death, however, were its consequences for the carefully constructed web of relationships, financial arrangements, and mutual dependencies that had sustained the Carnarvon household for nearly 3 decades. The Earl's death meant that the complex system of checks and balances that had prevented any single party from gaining complete control over the family's affairs was now fundamentally disrupted, creating opportunities for dramatic changes in the distribution of power and resources within the household. Alfred de Rothschild had died 5 years earlier in 1918, leaving Almina financially independent, but also removing the protective influence that had shielded her from the full consequences of her actions throughout her adult life. She was now a wealthy widow with no effective oversight, no restraining influence from either her husband or her benefactor, and a lifetime's worth of dangerous secrets that could be exposed at any moment by enemies who no longer needed to fear retaliation from powerful protectors. The speed with which Almina moved to secure her position after her husband's death revealed both her desperation and her fundamental ruthlessness in protecting her interests. Within weeks of returning from Egypt with Carnarvon's body, she had begun systematically liquidating assets from Alfred's estate, converting artwork, jewelry, and other valuable items into cash that could be more easily hidden from tax authorities and potential creditors. The scale of these transactions was enormous, involving the sale of Rothschild treasures worth hundreds of thousands of pounds through discreet auction houses and private dealers who specialized in handling sensitive disposals for wealthy clients. More significantly, she had also begun to distance herself from her son Henry, the new 6th Earl, whose own investigations into the family finances threatened to expose the full extent of her financial manipulations over the previous decades. Henry had inherited not only his father's title and estates, but also a growing awareness of the irregularities and potential illegalities that had characterized his mother's management of family resources during his father's frequent absences. The relationship between Almina and her son had been strained for years, partly because of Henry's growing suspicions about his own parentage, but more immediately because of his awareness of his mother's increasingly erratic and potentially criminal behavior. Henry possessed documentation that suggested Almina had been systematically embezzling funds from the estate for her own purposes, using her position as chatelaine to redirect resources that should have been used for maintaining Highclere and its associated properties to her personal accounts and private ventures. Henry had also begun to ask uncomfortable questions about the true nature of his mother's hospital operations and the sources of income that had allowed her to maintain such lavish facilities without apparent regard for cost or profitability. His investigations had revealed financial irregularities that suggested the hospitals had been used for purposes far beyond medical treatment, including activities that might have violated both medical ethics and criminal law. But Henry inherited not only his father's title, but also his fundamental weakness of character, lacking the strength or courage necessary to confront his mother directly about her misconduct while being unable to ignore the mounting evidence of her potential criminality. The result was a cold war between mother and son that would ultimately lead to Henry's most devastating betrayal. A betrayal that would destroy whatever remained of family loyalty while exposing Almina to legal and social consequences that she had spent decades trying to avoid. The situation became infinitely more complex and dangerous with Almina's hasty remarriage to Lieutenant Colonel Ian Onslow Denistone in December 1923, just 8 months after Carnarvon's death, and at a speed that shocked even London's scandal-hardened society observers. The marriage was clearly motivated by desperation rather than affection, representing Almina's attempt to secure protection and support from a man whose own moral flexibility and financial needs made him both a valuable ally and a potentially catastrophic liability. Denistone was everything that Carnarvon had not been: young, handsome, charming, physically vigorous, and absolutely without moral scruples or ethical constraints. He was also deeply in debt, recently divorced under scandalous circumstances, and carrying secrets of his own that made him both valuable and extremely dangerous as a marriage partner. His military record, while superficially impressive, concealed a pattern of behavior that had repeatedly brought him to the attention of his superior officers for reasons that had nothing to do with his professional competence. The circumstances of Almina's courtship with Denistone revealed the full extent of her moral corruption and her willingness to engage in criminal activity to protect her position and advance her interests. She had met him in Paris in 1920, 3 years before Carnarvon's death, at a time when her husband was in Egypt and she was ostensibly in France for medical treatment related to her hospital work. The meeting had been arranged through intermediaries who specialized in facilitating discreet relationships for wealthy individuals seeking companionship or services that could not be obtained through conventional social channels. Almina had immediately begun providing Denistone with substantial financial support in exchange for services that went far beyond mere companionship or social escort duties. Denistone's primary value to Almina was his willingness to serve as a front for increasingly sophisticated money laundering operations, allowing her to move funds through his bank accounts in ways that concealed their true ownership from tax authorities, creditors, and family members who might question her financial activities. The money laundering scheme operated through a network of shell companies, offshore accounts, and complex financial instruments that allowed Almina to convert assets from Alfred's estate into untraceable cash while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business transactions. Denistone's military connections provided access to international banking systems and foreign exchange markets that would have been difficult for Almina to access directly, while his social connections provided cover for transactions that might otherwise have attracted unwanted attention from authorities. More disturbing still was the evidence that emerged during later legal proceedings, suggesting that Almina and Denistone had been lovers while Carnarvon was still alive, conducting their affair with a brazenness that shocked even London's jaded society observers who were accustomed to discreet extramarital arrangements among the upper classes. Contemporary diary entries and letters preserved in private archives describe encounters between Almina and Denistone at locations throughout London and Paris, including hotels, private clubs, and even Almina's own hospital facilities. Denistone had been a frequent visitor to both of Almina's hospitals during the war, ostensibly as a patient receiving treatment for minor injuries sustained during military service, but actually serving as her accomplice in various financial schemes and intelligence-gathering operations. Their relationship had been an open secret among certain circles for years before Carnarvon's death made it legally possible for them to marry, with several prominent society figures later testifying that they had assumed the couple were already married in all but name. The marriage to Denistone also brought Almina into direct contact with Dorothy Denistone, the Colonel's first wife, whose own story revealed the depths of moral depravity that characterized the social circles in which Almina now moved, and the kinds of arrangements that wealthy and powerful individuals were willing to make in pursuit of their personal and professional interests. Dorothy Denistone was herself a figure of considerable complexity and moral ambiguity, a woman who had been effectively prostituted by her husband to General Sir John Cowans, the British Army's Quartermaster General, in exchange for military promotions and lucrative business opportunities that had advanced Denistone's career while providing him with access to government contracts and insider information that he had used for personal profit. The arrangement between Dorothy, her husband, and General Cowans had continued for years during and after World War I, with Dorothy serving as the general's mistress while remaining legally married to Denistone. A triangular relationship that provided all parties with the sexual gratification, financial benefits, and professional advancement they desired, while maintaining a careful veneer of respectability that protected them from public scandal. Dorothy's position in this arrangement was both powerful and precarious, as she possessed intimate knowledge of government secrets and military operations that made her valuable to her lovers, while simultaneously making her a potential security risk that could be eliminated if she became inconvenient or demanding. Her relationship with General Cowans had provided her with access to classified information, government contracts, and high-level military planning that went far beyond what any civilian should have been allowed to know. When Dorothy learned of Denistone's marriage to the wealthy Countess of Carnarvon, she saw an opportunity to escape from the degrading arrangement that had defined her adult life, while simultaneously gaining financial security that would make her independent of both her former husband and her military lover. Her demand for the alimony that Denistone had promised but never paid was, on its surface, a simple matter of contract enforcement and marital obligation. In reality, however, Dorothy's legal action represented a direct threat to the entire system of lies, financial manipulation, and criminal activity that Almina had constructed around herself over the previous 3 decades. Dorothy possessed detailed knowledge of Denistone's financial arrangements with Almina, including information about money laundering operations, tax evasion schemes, and other illegal activities that could result in criminal prosecution and imprisonment for both of them. More dangerously still, Dorothy's intimate relationship with General Cowans had provided her with access to government intelligence about Almina's hospital operations during the war, including reports that suggested these facilities had been used for espionage activities, illegal medical procedures, and other forms of criminal enterprise that went far beyond the charitable work that had been presented to the public. The court case that resulted, Denistone v. Denistone, heard in the King's Bench Division of the High Court in March 1925, became one of the most sensational legal proceedings of the decade, exposing not only the sordid details of Dorothy's arranged prostitution and the corrupt military contracts that had enriched her lovers, but also the full extent of Almina's financial crimes, moral compromises, and systematic exploitation of vulnerable individuals for personal gain. The trial lasted for 17 days and generated newspaper coverage that rivaled royal scandals for public attention and social impact. Under oath and facing the threat of perjury charges, Almina was forced to admit to adultery, money laundering, tax evasion, the systematic exploitation of wounded soldiers for personal gain, and participation in illegal medical procedures that had endangered the lives of patients who had trusted her with their care. The most damaging revelation to emerge from the trial was the testimony of several former patients from Almina's hospitals who described a systematic pattern of sexual exploitation, financial extortion, and medical malpractice that revealed her charitable work to have been a carefully constructed front for criminal enterprise. Wounded officers spoke of being pressured into intimate relationships with the Countess, of being blackmailed with information gathered during their most vulnerable moments, and of being forced to participate in financial schemes that they didn't understand but that ultimately enriched Almina at their expense. Even more shocking was the testimony regarding Almina's London nursing homes, which multiple witnesses described as fronts for illegal abortion services provided to wealthy women desperate to avoid social scandal and criminal prosecution. Dr. Harold Hendy, testifying under immunity from prosecution, revealed that Almina had personally performed dozens of illegal procedures using her medical facilities to generate enormous profits while placing her patients at grave physical risk and exposing them to potential blackmail based on their need for illegal services. The jury's verdict in the Dennistoun case, technically a victory for Almina and her husband that rejected Dorothy's financial claims, came at a cost that effectively destroyed everything she had spent her lifetime building and left her more vulnerable to exposure and retribution than at any point in her long career of deception and exploitation. While the legal decision went in her favor, the reputational damage was catastrophic and irreversible, exposing her to social ostracism, financial ruin, and criminal prosecution that would define the remainder of her life. The immediate financial cost alone was staggering, consuming nearly $400,000 of her remaining wealth in legal fees, court costs, and related expenses that represented one of the largest legal judgments of the decade. But the reputational damage proved far more devastating than any monetary loss, as London society, which had tolerated Almina's eccentricities and overlooked her questionable behavior as long as she maintained a veneer of respectability and provided valuable services to influential individuals, now ostracized her completely and permanently. The social circles that had once competed for her attention now treated her as a pariah, with former friends and associates publicly distancing themselves from any connection to her or her activities. Invitations to important social events ceased to arrive. Charitable organizations quietly removed her name from their boards and patron lists, and even tradespeople who had previously been eager to serve the Countess of Carnarvon now demanded cash payment in advance for their services. More devastating still was the response of her own family, particularly her son Henry, who used his mother's legal troubles as an opportunity to launch his own comprehensive investigation into her financial activities and their impact on the Carnarvon estate. What Henry discovered was a systematic pattern of embezzlement, fraud, and asset stripping that went back decades and involved not only the misappropriation of funds provided by Alfred de Rothschild, but also the systematic looting of Highclere's art collections, library holdings, and other valuable assets that rightfully belonged to the estate rather than to Almina personally. Henry's investigation revealed that Almina had been selling family treasures for years, using the proceeds to fund her personal lifestyle, her hospital operations, and her increasingly expensive efforts to maintain her social position and political influence. Priceless paintings had been replaced with clever forgeries, rare books and manuscripts had been sold to private collectors, and valuable jewelry had been systematically replaced with paste copies that could pass casual inspection but were worthless. The extent of the theft was breathtaking in both its scope and its audacity, representing not merely the taking of money, but the systematic destruction of centuries of family heritage and cultural patrimony. Items that had been in the Herbert family for generations, including gifts from monarchs and artifacts of genuine historical significance, had been converted into cash to support Almina's personal ambitions and criminal enterprises. In 1951, acting on detailed information provided by Henry and armed with evidence gathered by private investigators working on behalf of the estate, the Inland Revenue formally charged Almina with tax evasion covering multiple decades and demanded payment of back taxes, penalties, and interest that consumed the remainder of her fortune and left her facing the possibility of criminal prosecution and imprisonment. The tax case revealed the full sophistication of Almina's financial crimes, involving offshore accounts, shell companies, and complex money laundering schemes that had allowed her to hide millions of pounds from British tax authorities while maintaining the fiction of legitimate charitable and business activities. The investigation uncovered evidence of systematic fraud dating back to the early years of her marriage, suggesting that her criminal activities had begun almost immediately after her arrival at Highclere and had continued uninterrupted for more than 5 decades. The woman who had once commanded millions of pounds and wielded influence throughout the highest levels of British society found herself declared bankrupt and forced to sell her few remaining possessions to satisfy creditors and tax obligations. The bankruptcy proceedings revealed the true extent of her financial desperation, as even items of minimal value were seized and sold to generate funds for debt repayment. The final decades of Almina's life were marked by a relentless downward spiral that seemed designed to mirror the suffering she had inflicted on others throughout her career of exploitation and manipulation. Denistoone's death from chronic asthma in 1938 left her alone and increasingly desperate, dependent on the charity of former associates who remembered her power but felt no obligation to support her in her decline and disgrace. Her attempts to restart her nursing home business failed repeatedly, partly because of her damaged reputation, but also because the methods she had previously used to generate profits were no longer tolerable even to the morally flexible circles in which she had once moved. Government oversight of medical facilities had increased substantially since the war, making it impossible to operate the kind of unregulated establishments that had previously provided her with both income and opportunities for exploitation. Most pathetically, Almina spent her final years attempting to trade on her connection to the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, writing articles for popular magazines and giving lectures that promised to reveal insider secrets about the famous archaeological find and her role in financing the expedition that had made the discovery possible. But even these efforts were tainted by her inability to distinguish between truth and self-serving fiction, leading her to invent increasingly elaborate stories about her relationship with Howard Carter and her personal involvement in the excavation process. The lectures and articles revealed a mind that had lost the ability to distinguish between reality and the elaborate fantasies she had constructed to justify her actions and maintain her sense of self-importance. Contemporary accounts describe presentations that mixed genuine historical information with obvious fabrications, delivered by a woman whose mental faculties were clearly deteriorating, but who maintained her compulsive need to be the center of attention and admiration. The end came on May 8, 1969, in that modest terraced house in Bristol, where Almina lived with Anne Ledbetter, a former employee who had remained loyal despite decades of mistreatment and financial exploitation. Anne had worked for Almina since the 1930s, initially as a nurse in her medical facilities, but later as a general companion and housekeeper who provided the practical support that Almina needed to maintain even the most basic standards of daily life. The official cause of death, choking on a piece of chicken gristle while eating dinner, seemed almost cruelly appropriate for a woman who had spent her life consuming more than she could safely handle, whether in terms of wealth, power, or the secrets and vulnerabilities of others. The death was swift and apparently painless, but it came at the end of years of increasing isolation, poverty, and mental deterioration that had reduced one of the most powerful women of her generation to a forgotten elderly lady living in obscurity. Yet even in death, Almina's capacity for generating controversy and inflicting final wounds continued to manifest itself. Her will, when it was read several weeks after her funeral, revealed one final act of vindictiveness and manipulation directed at the family members who had ultimately rejected her and the social institutions that had abandoned her in her time of need. Rather than leaving her remaining estate to her son Henry or her grandchildren, who might have been expected to inherit whatever remained of her once vast fortune, Almina chose to bequeath the bulk of her assets to Anthony Ledbetter, Anne's son, who had cared for her during her final years and had shown her the loyalty and attention that her own family had withdrawn. The decision was partly motivated by genuine gratitude toward the Ledbetter family, who had provided her with practical and emotional support when she had nowhere else to turn. But those who had known Almina throughout her life understood that the bequest also represented a final act of revenge against the son who had exposed her crimes and the grandson who had inherited the title and estates that she had once controlled. The discovery of Almina's extensive personal papers, diaries, and correspondence after her death provided historians and biographers with an unprecedented window into the mind of a woman who had systematically corrupted everyone and everything she had touched throughout her long and destructive career. Her own words, preserved in thousands of pages of handwritten notes and private reflections, revealed a personality marked by narcissism, paranoia, and an almost complete inability to distinguish between reality and the elaborate fictions she had constructed to justify her actions and maintain her self-image. The diaries covered more than 50 years of her life and documented not only her major crimes and scandals, but also the psychological processes that had allowed her to rationalize behavior that would have been unthinkable to individuals with normal moral development. They revealed a woman who had genuinely convinced herself that her exploitation of others was actually a form of service to them, and that her criminal activities were justified by the good work she had done during the war and her contributions to British society. Perhaps most disturbing of all was Almina's apparent belief, maintained until the very end of her life, that she had been the victim rather than the perpetrator of the various scandals and criminal prosecutions that had defined her later years. Her diaries were filled with bitter complaints about the ingratitude of those she claimed to have helped, the jealousy of those who had failed to appreciate her contributions to society, and the unfairness of a legal and social system that had refused to understand her true nature and value. The final entries, written in an increasingly shaky hand during the months before her death, revealed a mind that had retreated almost completely into fantasy, constructing elaborate alternative versions of her life story in which she appeared as a misunderstood benefactor whose only crime had been excessive generosity toward people who had proven unworthy of her assistance. This remarkable story shows us how power, when built on deception and maintained through systematic exploitation, ultimately consumes those who wield it as completely as it destroys those who fall victim to it. Almina Herbert, Countess of Carnarvon, achieved everything she thought she wanted: wealth, title, social position, and influence over some of the most powerful individuals in British society. But in pursuing these goals through corruption and moral compromise, she created the very forces that would ultimately destroy her. Her life serves as a dark mirror to the glittering world of aristocratic privilege that continues to fascinate popular culture through productions like Downton Abbey, revealing that behind the elegant facades and refined manners of the British upper classes lay the same human capacity for greed, exploitation, and moral corruption that exists in every society and every historical period. What do you think of this extraordinary story? Do you believe Almina was ultimately a victim of circumstances beyond her control, or was she the calculating architect of her own destruction and the suffering of countless others? Leave your comments below and share your thoughts on this remarkable tale of ambition, corruption, and ultimate justice. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most scandalous and complex figures, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with anyone who appreciates the darker truths that lie hidden beneath the surface of respectable society. The truth, as we've seen, is often far more shocking than any fiction. And the real Downton Abbey was a place where secrets could kill, power came at the ultimate price, and even the most carefully constructed lies eventually crumble under the weight of their own contradictions.